When you picture the Wild West, you probably see a dusty street at high noon, a fearless cowboy staring down an outlaw, hand hovering just inches from a six-shooter. For over a century, the entertainment industry has sold us this exact image. They framed the American frontier as a theater of constant violence and thrilling danger. This perception is reinforced by surviving artifacts. We see the bold letters on old reward posters demanding outlaws be brought in dead or alive, promising massive sums of gold, and we assume every town was under siege. But that global image is largely a mirage. To understand what actually happened out there, we have to turn off the movies and look at the grit and dirt of the real frontier. The true story starts in the years following the American Civil War. Millions of people packed whatever they had into wagons and headed west, into vast deserts and unforgiving mountain ranges, simply looking for a better life. They were driven by intense economic pressure. Families wanted to claim their own land. Miners were chasing the massive wealth promised by the gold rush, and huge labor forces were laying down the railroad tracks that would finally connect the coasts. As money and people flowed in, isolated mining camps exploded into busy, densely packed commercial towns almost overnight. The early frontier was defined by this sudden surge of industry. It was a place of exhausting labor, where the primary struggle was against poverty and the elements. No figure represents the cinematic illusion better than the cowboy. Hollywood tells us they were roaming vigilantes who spent their days shooting it out with bandits. In reality, they were low-paid, working-class laborers. Their actual job required them to rustle livestock in the dirt and drive massive herds of cattle across hundreds of miles of open, empty terrain. It was a brutal, monotonous existence. They endured blazing summer heat, freezing nights under the open sky, and unpredictable animal stampedes. When they weren't in the saddle, they were mending fences and caring for horses. If these men possessed any heroism, it was born entirely from their physical endurance and their ability to survive in a deeply hostile environment. Of course, the frontier did have its share of criminals. Figures like Billy the Kid gained highly recognizable names for their violent behavior. Men like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy did organize daring, highly publicized bank and train robberies. But their massive fame was intentional. Back east, newspaper publishers and fiction writers quickly figured out that dramatic tales of frontier crime sold a tremendous amount of copies. They flooded the market with cheap publications just like this one. Writers took ordinary thieves and rebranded them with heroic postures and dramatic titles, turning petty criminals into complex, exciting anti-heroes. While the stolen cash and the violence were real, the romantic legend surrounding them was a carefully packaged product designed specifically to generate profit from readers safely far away. The men hired to stop those criminals received the exact same fictional treatment. The frontier sheriff is almost always depicted standing alone in the street, waiting for a duel. In practice, early lawmen were tasked with keeping the peace in isolated, expanding settlements with almost no budget or backup. Their jobs required pragmatic de-escalation. We see this same distortion in the town's central meeting place, the saloon. On screen, it's a building where poker games inevitably end in murder. Looking at the actual photographs, we find a much calmer reality. The saloon functioned as the vital economic heart of the community. It was simply the place where tired travelers stopped to eat, read the news, and socialize after a long day of labor. Both the lawman and the saloon were focused on basic survival and community building, standing in stark contrast to the blood-soaked arenas we expect. What happened to the West is a massive historical feedback loop. Exaggerated newspaper reports inspired sensationalized dime novels, which provided blueprints for Hollywood directors. With every decade, the stories were amplified. The caricature completely eclipsed the original historical events in the public consciousness. Ultimately, the Wild West we know today is one of America's most successful fictions, a narrative constructed entirely by the media, rather than the people who actually lived it. The reality of the 1800s is a profound story of human resilience. It was defined by exhausting physical labor and a continuous fight to survive. But that leaves us with a lingering question. If we strip away all the Hollywood exaggeration, the dime novels, and the fake heroics, was the frontier actually dangerous at all? Did everyday history just receive a theatrical makeover? Or were those isolated, growing towns hiding a different, much darker type of criminality beneath the dust? Dismantling the cinematic illusion is only our first step. Now we have to find out what truly filled that vacuum. Picture the classic American frontier, a dusty main street at high noon, and two men facing off, hands hovering over their holstered revolvers. Movies and television have taught us that these expansion-era settlements were completely lawless, overrun by violent outlaws where daily shootouts were a standard fact of life. The historical record paints a different picture. That specific, violent world is a manufactured illusion. If the frontier was not a land of action hero cowboys and daily duels in the street, what was actually happening out there? To understand the real American West, we must strip away over a century of cinematic fiction. The 19th century frontier was defined by grueling manual labor, heavily regulated settlements, and the slow, complex process of building permanent communities from the ground up. The unvarnished reality of how people lived and survived out west proves to be far more interesting than the movies. We can start with the most enduring myth, that every western town was a hotbed of unregulated gun violence. Local leaders and frontier residents recognized early on that violence was terrible for the local economy. Investors, businesses, and migrating families required stability, and random gunfire actively scared away capital. To protect their growing economies, many towns enacted strict weapon ordinances. Visitors arriving in places like Dodge City or Tombstone were frequently required by law to hand over their revolvers and rifles upon entering town, collecting them only when they left. While infamous gunfights did occur, they made national headlines precisely because they were massive historical anomalies, not the everyday baseline of Western life. The movie industry also took the frontier worker and elevated him into a glamorous action hero. Looking at this scale of livestock, you can see the actual job of a cowboy. It involved 14-hour days of exhausting manual labor handling massive herds. Most time was spent repairing fences, fixing equipment, caring for horses, and sleeping outdoors. Criminals were rarely their primary concern. As you can see from these rough camp setups, a cowboy's greatest threats were natural elements, like sudden winter storms, crossing swollen rivers, and avoiding deadly cattle stampedes. The vast majority of historical cowboys were low-paid agricultural workers. Many of them lived their entire lives on the plains and never fired a weapon in a real fight. We do, of course, remember names like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, but their fame was heavily fueled by a 19th century media machine. Eastern newspapers and dime novels relied on sensational, exaggerated stories to sell more copies to an eager public. By embellishing bank robberies and train heists, the press elevated a very small number of criminals into larger-than-life figures. As these dramatic reports spread across the country, readers began to believe that the entire Western territory was controlled by organized criminal syndicates. This was a massive distortion. The overwhelming majority of settlers were pursuing stable jobs in safe communities, living their lives completely disconnected from outlaw violence. By focusing almost exclusively on gunfights and outlaws, the traditional Hollywood narrative erased a much more complex history to keep its stories morally simple. Early Western films frequently reduced Native Americans to one-dimensional villains for the heroes to overcome. Long before westward expansion, hundreds of diverse Native American nations thrived across the continent, maintaining rich cultures, complex languages, and deep traditions. As agricultural and industrial settlements expanded westward, these tribes experienced profound devastation through forced relocations, broken government treaties, and violent territorial conflicts. Acknowledging this complicated, tragic displacement is an essential part of understanding what actually happened on the frontier. Without it, any history of the era remains incomplete. The version of the Wild West we recognize today took shape in the early 1900s as film directors capitalized on newspaper exaggerations. By carefully staging gunfights and casting fearless heroes, the studios blurred the line between historical fact and cinematic fiction. Today, when most people try to picture the historical Wild West, they are actually just recalling a 20th century Hollywood product. The true story of the frontier was not decided by revolvers. It was defined by thousands of ordinary people attempting to build a functioning society out of an unforgiving landscape. Massive logistical and infrastructural projects physically connected distant regions of the country, driven by the arduous, dangerous labor of laying down thousands of miles of railroad tracks. Farmers and families broke the hard soil, building the first permanent agricultural communities and surviving bitter winters in small sod homes. The arrival of teachers and the construction of local schools transformed rough, temporary camps into stable, multi-generational towns. Merchants set up general stores to supply essential goods, and doctors opened local clinics, driving the daily economic growth that truly secured the region's future. We do not need Hollywood fabrications to make the West compelling. The authentic history, a complex blend of ambition, grueling hardship, profound tragedy, and community building, stands on its own.